I never expected my career to land me here, in the middle of the most baffling case of my life. As a former aviation investigator, I'd seen my fair share of strange disappearances and peculiar crashes. But the disappearance of Flight Horizon 717 wasn't just strange, it was impossible. A private jet vanishing mid-flight without a trace was a puzzle I wasn't sure I'd ever piece together. I was called in 2 days after the jet disappeared off the radar. Its flight path was a simple one, London to Zurich, a route I'd analyzed dozens of times in other cases. The jet carried 4 passengers, 2 pilots, and the jewels, diamonds, emeralds, and rubies, reportedly worth over $200 million. The shipment was heavily insured, the security impeccable, and the jet itself was a state-of-the-art Gulfstream G700, the kind of machine that didn't just fall out of the sky unnoticed. The first thing I did was pore over the flight logs and the ATC recordings. Everything about the flight seemed routine until the moment it disappeared. At 11:37 p.m., the pilots reported smooth cruising conditions at 41,000 feet. 4 minutes later, the plane vanished. No distress calls, no radar blips, just nothing. "Think it was hijacked?" asked Julia, my second in command. She was sharp, relentless, and knew how to cut through the noise. We'd worked together for years, but this case had her unusually tense. "Maybe," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. Hijackers usually wanted attention, demands, leverage. But there had been no such signals or claims. "Or it could be sabotage. Or an inside job." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Inside job?" I leaned back in my chair, tapping the side of my pen against the table. "We've got a plane carrying one of the most expensive cargoes on Earth, and the only people on board are 2 pilots, a jewel courier, and 3 high-profile passengers. It's worth asking if one of them knew more than they let on." She nodded, but neither of us spoke, the thought hanging in the air. If it was an inside job, where was the plane? And what about the passengers? The families of the missing were already demanding answers, and the pressure was mounting from the insurance companies, the jewel owners, and the media. "The plane didn't just vanish into thin air," I said. But as the hours turned into days, it was beginning to feel like it had. The jet's last known location was somewhere over the English Channel, a vast stretch of water known for its heavy traffic and difficult conditions. Satellite imagery revealed nothing unusual, no signs of debris, no emergency landings. Even the transponder data, which could normally track a plane's every move, had stopped transmitting in the exact second the jet disappeared. "It's like it was wiped off the map," Julia muttered. She had the look of someone desperately trying to piece together a puzzle that refused to cooperate. I decided to focus on the passengers next. The manifest listed 3 names: Peter Cartwright, a wealthy Swiss financier; Elaine Rivera, a retired Hollywood actress; and Hassan Jafari, an Iranian businessman with a penchant for rare jewels. All 3 were high profile, and each had a plausible reason to be on the flight. But something about them didn't sit right with me. Cartwright was a known dealmaker, someone who thrived on brokering high-risk ventures. Rivera's career had left her with a public image of charm and elegance, but her financial troubles in recent years made her presence on a flight carrying jewels worth millions suspicious. And Jafari? His ties to the international gemstone trade made him the most likely suspect, though nothing concrete linked him to a theft of this scale. As for the courier, Lucas Barrett, his job was simple: protect the jewels at all costs. His company was known for employing only the most loyal and experienced operatives, and by all accounts, Lucas had an impeccable record. But impeccable records didn't mean much when $200 million vanished without a trace. The deeper I dug into their backgrounds, the murkier the waters became. Cartwright had several offshore accounts that were flagged by Interpol. Rivera's recent bankruptcy filings hinted at desperation, and Jafari had been linked to a smuggling ring in Eastern Europe. It was a web of deceit, and I couldn't shake the feeling that one of them, or perhaps all of them, had something to hide. "Someone on that plane knew what was going to happen," I told Julia, as we reviewed the case in our makeshift headquarters near the Channel coast. "This wasn't an accident." Julia folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Then we'd better figure out who, and fast, because whoever it was, they just pulled off the heist of the century." The coast was eerie at dawn. the fog rolling in thick and slow over the English Channel. Our makeshift command center, a cramped room above a coastal radar station, was a hive of activity. Technicians scoured radar logs, analysts pored over shipping routes, and Julia and I sat in the corner, piecing together a timeline that felt increasingly like fiction. The breakthrough came when a local fisherman reported something unusual. He'd been trawling the waters around 3 a.m. the night of the disappearance when he spotted a low-flying jet, its lights off, banking hard to the southeast. It wasn't crashing, the fisherman insisted, leaning forward in his chair during his interview. Looked like it was trying to lose anyone who might have been following it. His account was the first concrete lead we'd had in days. The flight path he described didn't match the official plan filed by Horizon 717. If the pilots had deviated, they had to have done so deliberately. But why? I stared at the map spread out on the table, the channel dotted with shipping lanes, tiny islands, and sprawling coastal cities. If they were heading southeast, I muttered, tracing a line with my finger, they could have been aiming for Normandy, or even further south. Julia tapped her pen against her notebook, deep in thought. If they were low enough, they'd avoid radar detection from commercial and military stations. Maybe they were planning to land on one of the smaller airstrips in the region. The idea made sense, but we had no evidence to support it. The radar logs from nearby stations were spotty at best, and no one had reported a plane landing where it shouldn't have. But the fisherman's account gave us a narrow window to work with, and that was better than nothing. Let's focus on private airstrips and secluded landing sites, I said. The kind of place someone could stash a jet without drawing attention. Hours turned into a grueling day of dead ends and false leads. Dozens of airfields turned up nothing unusual. The frustration was palpable in the room, but Julia refused to let us lose momentum. The answer's out there, she said, pacing back and forth. We're just not looking in the right place. Then as night fell, we caught a break. A farmer near a remote coastal stretch in Normandy reported hearing a loud engine overhead the night of the disappearance. He described it as a screaming roar, something far larger than any of the crop dusters or commuter planes he was used to. Julia and I were on the first ferry out the next morning. As we drove through the winding back roads of the Normandy coast, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were closing in on something big. The farmer, an older man with leathery skin and a heavy accent, led us to a field a few miles from his house. There, he said, pointing to a patch of churned-up earth at the edge of the clearing. Something heavy landed here. I'd bet my tractor on it. The ground told the story. The deep grooves and flattened grass were unmistakable. Landing gear marks, precisely aligned as if a jet had touched down here in the dead of night. But the plane was long gone, leaving only the faint smell of aviation fuel and a scattering of small debris. Julia crouched down, picking up a tiny fragment of polished metal. This isn't part of the plane, she said, examining it closely. Looks like it came from a cargo container. My pulse quickened. The jewels, I whispered. But if the jewels had been unloaded here, where had they gone next? The tracks leading away from the landing site were muddled and difficult to follow, but they pointed toward the nearby forest. The tension mounted as we moved deeper into the woods. Every broken branch and flattened patch of grass felt like a breadcrumb, leading us closer to the truth. And then we found it, a burnt-out truck, its charred frame barely recognizable. Inside, we discovered scraps of velvet-lined cases, the kind used to transport high-value items. They torched the truck to cover their tracks, Julia said grimly. I nodded, my mind racing. This wasn't just a heist. It was an operation, meticulously planned and executed. The jewels had been offloaded, hidden, or transported somewhere else entirely. Whoever was behind this wasn't just clever. They were professionals. As we stood there in the dim light of the forest, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Stop digging or you'll regret it. Julia read the message over my shoulder, her jaw tightening. Looks like someone's watching us. Good, I said, pocketing my phone, because that means we're getting closer. By the time we returned to our command center, it was clear that we'd rattled someone's cage. The message on my phone wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. Whoever had pulled off this heist had resources, connections, and now an apparent desire to keep us from uncovering the truth. The charred truck had provided little beyond the scorched remains of the jewel cases, but the farmer's field gave us a lead. Embedded in the landing site was a shard of glass from what appeared to be a navigation light. Julia sent it to the lab for analysis, hoping it might narrow down the type of aircraft used. But while we waited, another development shifted our focus. A private investigator in Monaco reached out with an intriguing lead. His name was Claude Renard, a grizzled veteran of the Riviera's high-stakes underworld, and he claimed to have overheard chatter about a priceless haul being fenced in the region. Monaco wasn't just a playground for the rich. It was a magnet for discreet transactions, where fortunes changed hands under the veil of luxury. If the jewels had surfaced anywhere, it was here. Julia and I boarded a red-eye flight to Nice and drove the winding coastal road into Monaco as the sun rose, its rays bouncing off the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean. The principality was already awake, its streets buzzing with tourists and locals alike. But beneath the glamour, Monaco hid secrets in plain sight. Claude met us at a cafe overlooking the harbor, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was every bit the cliché I'd expected: rumpled suit, permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and a wary glint in his eye. "Word on the street is that something big came through last night," he said, leaning in close. "A dealer named Moretti. Small-time operator, but he's been flashing new money, which isn't like him." Julia arched an eyebrow. "And you think he's connected to the jewels?" Claude shrugged. "Can't say for sure, but he's not smart enough to be a player in this game. If he's involved, he's just a middleman." We didn't waste time. Moretti operated out of a nondescript art gallery tucked away in one of Monaco's quieter alleys. Posing as collectors interested in acquiring rare pieces, Julia and I managed to secure a meeting. The gallery was dimly lit, its walls adorned with paintings and sculptures that screamed pretension. Moretti greeted us with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, his nervous energy palpable. "We're looking for something unique," Julia said, her tone dripping with faux charm. Moretti's expression flickered for a split second, a hint of recognition crossing his face. He knew what we were after, but he wasn't going to make it easy. "I deal in art, not trinkets," he said, leading us to a display case of overpriced figurines. I decided to press. "We've heard you've recently acquired something extraordinary, a collection so valuable it could redefine the market." Moretti froze, his fingers twitching slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tightening. Julia leaned in, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Listen, Moretti, we're not here to cause trouble. We just want to know where the jewels are. If you're not the end of the line, then help us find who is." For a moment I thought he might cave, but instead he straightened up, his facade of politeness cracking. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," he said sharply, gesturing toward the door. As we left the gallery, I couldn't shake the feeling that Moretti was hiding something, and that suspicion was confirmed when Claude called later that evening with an urgent message. "They've found Moretti," he said grimly, "dead. Looks like he tried to run, but someone caught up with him first." The news hit like a punch to the gut. Moretti had been our best lead, and now he was gone. But his death wasn't just a loose end, it was a warning. The people behind this heist were cleaning house, and we were dangerously close to being next. Julia and I spent the night combing through every detail we had on Moretti, hoping to find something, anything that could point us in the right direction. That's when we stumbled upon his encrypted financial records, stored on a cloud drive we'd managed to clone during our meeting. After hours of decoding, the pieces finally started falling into place. Moretti had received a substantial payment just days before the heist, wired from an account linked to a shell corporation based in Dubai. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. And as we prepared to follow it, I couldn't shake the feeling that every step forward was leading us deeper into a trap. The trail led us to Dubai, a city of shimmering skyscrapers and secrets hidden in plain sight. The Shell Corporation, linked to Moretti's payment, was one of hundreds registered in the glittering emirate, a place where anonymity was a service as much as a luxury. Julia and I landed just after midnight, the warm desert air wrapping around us as we stepped off the plane. This wasn't the first time I'd chased a lead to Dubai, but it was the first time I felt the stakes so viscerally. Someone had already silenced Moretti, and now we were poking at the same hornet's nest. Our first stop was the Free Trade Zone office, a hub of corporate registration. We posed as potential investors, using fake credentials to secure a private meeting. The clerk, a young man in an impeccable suit, smiled as he walked us through the intricacies of offshore registrations. "This is the corporation you're interested in?" he asked, pulling up a file on his monitor. The screen displayed a basic dossier, Aurora Holdings LLC. It was as generic as they came, but the name of the corporate director caught my attention, Liam Wolfe. Liam Wolfe was an infamous name in certain circles. A British national with ties to organized crime, he'd built a reputation as a broker for the world's most elusive deals. If Wolfe was involved, this heist wasn't just about the jewels, it was about something bigger. "We'd like to arrange a meeting," Julia said smoothly. The clerk hesitated, his smile faltering. "I'm afraid I can't provide that information. We take our clients' privacy very seriously." Julia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "We're not just anyone. Mr. Wolfe will want to hear what we have to offer." It was a gamble, but it paid off. The clerk handed us a business card with a phone number scrawled on the back. "This is the best I can do. The rest is up to you." The card led us to the Owl Circle district, an industrial area turned art haven. It was an odd location for a man like Wolfe, but that only made me more certain we were on the right track. We arrived at a warehouse, its exterior unassuming, with nothing to indicate the power moves being orchestrated inside. Two guards flanked the entrance, their postures rigid as they sized us up. "We're here to see Mr. Wolfe," I said, holding up the business card. The guards exchanged a glance before one of them stepped aside, gesturing us in. The interior of the warehouse was a stark contrast to its exterior. A lavishly furnished space with modern art on the walls and a long, sleek table at its center. Wolfe sat at the head, his tailored suit and piercing blue eyes giving him an air of calculated menace. "Mr. Wolfe," I began, my tone measured, "we've come a long way to speak with you." He smiled faintly, gesturing for us to sit. "I'm flattered, but flattery doesn't buy you my time. What do you want?" Julia took the lead, sliding a photo of the missing jewels across the table. "We know you're connected to these. We want to know where they are." Wolfe chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Do you have any idea how many people come to me with accusations like this? I could spend all day denying things I've never done." "You paid Moretti," I said, my voice cutting through his theatrics. "And now he's dead. That doesn't look like coincidence to us." His smile faded, replaced by a cold intensity. "Moretti was a fool. If he's dead, it's because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. But that has nothing to do with me. I knew he was lying, but pushing him too hard would get us nowhere." Julia shifted gears, her tone softening. "We're not here to make enemies. We want the same thing you do, to find the jewels and make this disappear quietly. Help us, and we'll make it worth your while." Wolfe considered her words, his eyes narrowing. "You're either brave or stupid, coming here and asking me to betray my business partners." "And yet," I countered, "you haven't kicked us out." That seemed to amuse him. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "There's a shipment leaving tonight. Dock 14. If the jewels are anywhere, they'll be on that ship. But I'm warning you, if you step on that dock, you'd better be ready for what comes next." We left the warehouse with the coordinates and a sense of foreboding. Wolfe's warning wasn't just bravado. It was a promise. The docks were a maze of shipping containers and heavy machinery, illuminated by the cold glow of floodlights. As we approached Dock 14, my instincts screamed at me to turn back. But the thought of those jewels and the lives they'd already cost kept me moving forward. What we found at the dock wasn't just a shipment, it was a trap, and we'd walk straight into it. The sound of steel boots clanging against metal echoed through the air before I even saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their weapons glinting in the pale floodlights. Julia and I froze, instinctively ducking behind a stack of shipping crates. The ambush had been meticulously planned, the way Wolfe's vague warnings suggested it might be. "Step out now!" a gruff voice bellowed, amplified by a megaphone. "You're surrounded. No one needs to get hurt." Julia peeked around the corner, her face grim. 5 of them, armed, more coming up the far side. This isn't just security, this is paramilitary. My mind raced. This wasn't Wolfe's doing. He was too subtle for brute force tactics. These men were someone else's insurance policy, a third party. Or maybe Wolfe's partners didn't trust him as much as he thought. Options? I whispered, my pulse hammering. Julia reached into her bag, pulling out a small smoke canister. This buys us a minute, tops. After that, we improvise. I didn't like it, but it wasn't like we had a better plan. I nodded, gripping a rusted pipe I'd grabbed from the ground. On your count. She activated the canister and rolled it into the open. A hiss followed as white smoke billowed out, engulfing the narrow lane between the crates. Shouts of confusion erupted as the fog spread, and we bolted, sticking low and weaving between containers. A sharp crack of gunfire sliced through the air, the bullets ricocheting off metal. My breath came in short bursts as adrenaline pushed me forward, the sound of heavy boots closing in behind us. This way, Julia hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a ladder bolted to the side of a container stack. We climbed as fast as we could, the steel rungs slippery with condensation. Reaching the top, we sprinted across the container roof, the labyrinth of shipping crates stretching out beneath us. There! Julia pointed to a crane platform a few containers over. We can get higher ground. The climb to the crane was nerve-wracking, every clang of our boots a beacon for our pursuers. When we finally reached the control cabin, Julia slammed the door shut and locked it. This won't hold them for long, I panted, leaning against the wall. She was already scanning the console, her fingers brushing over levers and buttons. We don't need long, just enough to make a statement. Statement! With a flick of a switch, the crane's massive arm grown to life, swinging one of the containers toward the docked ship. Julia's lips curled into a grim smile. If Wolf wasn't lying, and the jewels are on that ship, we're going to make sure no one gets to them before we do. The container smashed into the ship's hull with a deafening crash, steel crumpling like paper. Alarms blared as the dock lit up with red warning lights. Time to move, Julia said, grabbing my arm. We slid down the crane ladder, landing hard on the dock below. Chaos erupted around us. Security personnel scrambling to assess the damage, shouting orders over the blaring alarms. It was the distraction we needed. We slipped through the commotion, heading toward the breached ship. The gash in the hull was just big enough to climb through, and we found ourselves in the ship's cargo hold. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and oil, the faint hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the floor. Julia flicked on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Rows of crates lined the walls, stacked high and secured with steel bands. Julia moved to a smaller container marked with a red X. It was different, newer, with fresh paint and no shipping labels. This has to be it, she whispered. We pried the crate open, and my breath caught at the sight inside. Velvet-lined cases filled with glittering jewels, their brilliance undimmed by the dim light. Julia's fingers hovered over the treasure, but before she could grab anything, a voice boomed behind us. Step away from the crate. We turned to find Wolf himself standing there, flanked by two armed men. He looked calm, almost amused, as if he'd been expecting this all along. I warned you, Wolf said, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. And yet, here you are. Julia tensed beside me, her hand creeping toward her bag. But Wolf raised a finger, wagging it like a teacher scolding a disobedient child. Don't even think about it, he said. You've made quite the mess tonight, crashing my little operation, ruining a perfectly good ship. I'm impressed, but now it's time to settle up. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. If you kill us, you'll never get the rest of what you're looking for. Wolf arched an eyebrow. And what might that be? You tell me, I said, bluffing. You don't go through all this trouble for a few shiny rocks. For the first time, Wolf's composure faltered. It was brief, a flicker of hesitation, but it was enough. Julia seized the moment, throwing a flashbang from her bag. The blinding light and deafening noise gave us a precious few seconds to act. Grabbing the smallest case of jewels, we bolted deeper into the ship, leaving Wolf and his men disoriented behind us. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Wolf wasn't just another criminal, he was a predator. And now we were his prey. The labyrinthine corridors of the cargo ship stretched before us like a maze, the sound of Wolf's men recovering from the flashbang echoing ominously in the distance. Julia's flashlight bobbed ahead as she led the way, her pace frantic. My grip on the velvet-lined case of jewels was tight. It felt heavier than it should have. weighted not just with gems, but with the stakes of our survival. "We need to get off this ship before they regroup," Julia whispered, her voice sharp and focused. "We're in the middle of the harbor," I hissed back. "Unless you've got a submarine stashed somewhere." "Not a submarine," she cut in, yanking open a hatch that led to the deck. The salt-tinged night air hit us as we emerged, the vast expanse of the dark sea stretching in every direction. "But there's always lifeboats." The deck was alive with chaos. Crew members ran in all directions, responding to the breach, the alarms, and now the disruption Wolf's goons had caused. In the distance, floodlights scanned the dock, casting long, swinging beams across the water. Somewhere among the noise, I could hear Wolf barking orders, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. "There!" Julia pointed to a row of lifeboats suspended over the side of the ship. Without waiting for me to respond, she sprinted toward them. We scrambled into one of the small crafts, Julia immediately fumbling with the release mechanism. I set the jewel case down, keeping an eye on the ship's deck. Shadows moved against the floodlights, figures closing in, armed and dangerous. My heart thudded in my chest as I urged Julia to hurry. "Got it!" she exclaimed as the lifeboat's motor roared to life. With a jolt, the craft lowered toward the water, swaying precariously on its way down. A spray of bullets ricocheted off the metal hull, and I ducked instinctively, shielding the case with my body. The lifeboat hit the water with a splash, and Julia didn't waste a second, slamming the throttle forward. The engine growled as the craft surged away from the ship, cutting through the waves at breakneck speed. "Do you even know where we're going?" I shouted over the roar of the engine and the crashing waves. "Anywhere but here," Julia shot back, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind us, the ship loomed like a monolith, its silhouette punctuated by the frantic activity on its deck. More floodlights swept over the water, searching for us. The sound of another engine cut through the night, a speedboat, sleek and fast, closing in from the port side. Wolf's men. They'd anticipated our escape and were coming after us. "Hold on!" Julia shouted, jerking the wheel sharply to the left. The lifeboat veered, nearly capsizing as it skimmed the crest of a wave. I clung to the jewel case with one hand and the edge of the boat with the other, my knuckles white. The speedboat gained on us, its occupants firing warning shots that zinged past, dangerously close. Julia zigzagged across the water, trying to make us a harder target, but the lifeboat's smaller engine struggled to keep up. "Give me something to work with," I yelled, scanning the boat for anything that could even the odds. My eyes landed on an emergency flare gun, its orange casing tucked into a compartment near the console. I grabbed it, loading a single flare into the chamber. "Keep us steady," I called out, bracing myself as I aimed the flare gun over my shoulder. The speedboat was so close now I could see the grim determination on the men's faces, their weapons gleaming under the moonlight. I fired. The flare shot through the air like a comet, trailing sparks and smoke. It struck the front of the speedboat with a loud thud, exploding into a burst of fiery light. The men recoiled, momentarily blinded, and the boat veered wildly, slamming into a wave and losing momentum. "Nice shot!" Julia shouted, pushing the throttle to its limit. The lifeboat surged forward, the speedboat fading behind us. But our victory was short-lived. Another light appeared on the horizon, a second speedboat, larger and faster than the first. My stomach sank. Wolf had come prepared, and he wasn't giving up without a fight. "We can't outrun them," I said, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Julia's jaw tightened. "Then we outsmart them." Before I could ask what she meant, she cut the engine, plunging us into eerie silence. The lifeboat drifted, the waves slapping against its sides as the second speedboat bore down on us. "What are you doing?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "Hiding," she replied, pulling a tarp over the jewel case and motioning for me to stay low. "They'll expect us to keep running. Let's see if they're dumb enough to overshoot." We crouched under the tarp, the sound of the approaching speedboat growing louder with each second. I held my breath, my heart hammering as the searchlights swept over the water. The boat roared past us, its wake rocking the lifeboat violently. I dared to peek out, watching as it continued toward the open sea, its crew scanning the horizon for a target that wasn't there. Julia let out a shaky breath, her grip on the wheel loosening. "They'll circle back eventually, but that buys us time." I nodded, my thoughts racing. Wolf's resources were endless, his determination unrelenting. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And somewhere out there, he was waiting for his chance to strike again. As dawn broke over the vast expanse of the ocean, the horizon glowed with hues of gold and crimson, painting the water with an almost surreal beauty. The brief respite had allowed Julia and me to catch our breath, but it didn't erase the weight of the jewel case between us. Every passing moment felt like a countdown to another confrontation. The radio crackled to life, jolting us out of the fragile calm. A deep voice, menacing and deliberate, cut through the static. "You can't run forever, Miss Armitage." Or should I say, Agent Armitage? I turned to Julia, my confusion evident. "Agent?" Her face hardened, her eyes locked on the radio. "Wolf," she muttered under her breath, ignoring my question. Picking up the receiver, she replied, her tone icy. "If you think you're getting these jewels, you've underestimated me." A cold laugh came through the radio. "Oh, I don't care about the jewels anymore. This is personal now. You cost me far more than you can imagine." Julia slammed the receiver down, cutting him off. I stared at her, my mind racing. "You're a government agent? All this time and you never thought to tell me?" She sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. "I didn't plan for you to get involved, Damon. This was supposed to be a controlled operation. Wolf's network has been on Interpol's radar for years. These jewels were bait, and I was the hook." "Bait?" My voice rose in disbelief. "You used me as part of your setup?" Julia's expression softened, regret flickering in her eyes. "I didn't plan for you to be here, but I need you now. Wolf's resources are vast, and his men will find us if we don't end this on our terms." I clenched my fists, torn between anger and a grim understanding of the stakes. Before I could respond, the faint hum of engines echoed across the water. Julia's head snapped toward the sound, her face going pale. "They're coming." The speedboats were visible now, slicing through the waves with precision. Two of them, fast and armed, closing in like predators. There was no time to argue, no room for hesitation. Julia shoved the jewel case into my arms. "Take this and head for that rocky inlet." She pointed toward a jagged outcrop of cliffs in the distance. "I'll lead them away." "You can't be serious," I protested, but she was already starting the engine. "Go, Damon," she yelled, her voice firm with authority. "I'll buy you as much time as I can." Before I could argue further, she gunned the engine, the lifeboat lurching forward. I clung to the jewel case, my heart pounding as she steered us toward the cliffs. When we were close enough, Julia brought the boat to a stop and motioned for me to jump. With no other choice, I leapt into the shallow water, the jewel case clutched tightly in my arms. I waded onto the rocky shore, turning just in time to see Julia speeding off in the lifeboat, drawing Wolf's men away from the inlet. I scrambled up the rocks, searching for cover. The cliffs offered a vantage point, but it also made me a sitting duck if Wolf's men found me. From my perch, I watched as Julia led the speedboats on a wild chase, her craft darting and weaving with the skill of a seasoned sailor. The radio in my pocket crackled again. "You're clever, Armitage, but not clever enough," Wolf's voice sneered. "Enjoy your last moments." A sharp explosion rocked the air as one of the speedboats fired a rocket-propelled grenade. Julia's lifeboat swerved just in time, the blast sending a plume of water skyward, but she couldn't keep this up forever. I spotted a small cave in the cliffs, a place to hide, to regroup. With the jewel case in tow, I made my way inside, the darkness swallowing me. My hands trembled as I opened the case, revealing the sparkling contents. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds. More wealth than I'd ever seen, yet none of it felt worth the chaos it had unleashed. Another explosion boomed in the distance, and my chest tightened. Julia was buying me time, but at what cost? I fumbled with the radio, my voice shaky. "Julia, can you hear me? Get out of there. Forget the jewels." Her reply crackled through, breathless but resolute. "Not an option. Wolf's men need to think the jewels are with me. Stay hidden, Damon. This ends now." A third explosion rattled the cliffs, and then silence. The radio went dead. I sat there in the darkness, the weight of the jewels and Julia's fate pressing down on me. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one filled with dread and uncertainty. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed from the cave's entrance. My heart leapt, but I held my breath, gripping a rock as a makeshift weapon. A figure emerged, limping and soaked, but alive. Julia. She collapsed beside me, her face pale but triumphant. Wolf's men are dealt with, she managed, her voice weak. The jewels are safe. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I knew this wasn't over. Wolf would come back, and the jewels would remain a target. Julia looked at me, her expression grim but determined. We have to destroy them, Damon. It's the only way. I nodded, understanding what had to be done. The jewels had brought nothing but greed, betrayal, and bloodshed. Their destruction would be the final chapter in this harrowing ordeal. Together we would finish what we started and leave Wolf's empire in ruins.